It all began with what should have been a routine flight, one where passengers boarded expecting comfort, efficiency, and professionalism from the airline staff. Among those travelers was a highly respected black CEO, a man whose career had been built on discipline, integrity, and determination. He carried himself with quiet confidence, dressed sharply, and held his ticket for a VIP seat, a privilege he had earned through both his professional stature and the cost he had paid for the ticket. He entered the plane with the same courtesy and calmness he extended to people in boardrooms, meetings, and conferences, never expecting that his identity would become the very reason he would face humiliation. As he approached his designated seat, there was no indication of trouble. He placed his bag carefully, adjusted his jacket, and settled in like any passenger preparing for a journey. Around him, other travelers glanced briefly, some noticing his refined presence and others not paying much attention at all. For the CEO, it was just another flight. But for certain members of the crew, it became a moment to exercise authority in a way that revealed their underlying biases. It began subtly, with a flight attendant approaching him, her expression tight and her tone laced with false politeness. She leaned in, informing him that there had been a seating mix-up. Confused, he politely showed her his boarding pass, clearly indicating that the VIP seat was his. Instead of acknowledging the validity of his claim, the attendant's demeanor shifted slightly, firm but dismissive. She insisted there had been an error and that he would need to vacate the seat. The CEO, calm and measured, once again pointed to his documentation, making no scene, simply asserting his rightful place. Around him, passengers began to notice the exchange. A few whispered, sensing the tension. Others kept their eyes fixed forward, unwilling to get involved. It wasn't long before another passenger, a white man dressed in casual clothing but carrying himself with a sense of entitlement, appeared beside them. The attendant's attitude toward this new arrival was in stark contrast to how she had addressed the CEO. Her voice softened, her smile widened, and she quickly directed her attention to making the white passenger comfortable. The CEO stood there, momentarily suspended between anger and composure. He knew what had happened. Everyone who witnessed it knew what had happened. Yet the attendant spoke in clipped tones about company policy and necessary adjustments, words meant to mask the discrimination unfolding in plain sight. Passengers around them exchanged uneasy looks. Some were visibly uncomfortable, realizing that they were witnessing something deeply unfair. A few avoided eye contact, unwilling to challenge authority or disrupt their own peace. The CEO, however, felt the weight of the moment. He was not just being told to move from a seat, he was being told, without words, that his identity made him less worthy of the respect that his title, his accomplishments, and even his ticket had guaranteed. Every detail of that moment burned into his memory, the condescending tone of the attendant, the dismissive gestures, the way the white passenger smirked as if he had gained a prize, and the silence of those who chose not to speak. For the CEO, this was not just about a seat on a plane. It was about dignity. It was about the layers of discrimination that had followed him, sometimes openly and sometimes hidden behind polite smiles and official phrases, throughout his career and life. Here it was again, raw and unfiltered, in front of strangers who would go home that night with a story about what they had seen but never experienced themselves. The humiliation was not in being asked to move, it was in the refusal to acknowledge his rightful claim, the eagerness to prioritize someone else's comfort over his, and the quiet assumption that he would comply because of who he was. For a man who had spent years building companies, leading teams, and representing strength in boardrooms, it was a reminder that prejudice could still strip away respect in an instant. And in that cabin, filled with the murmurs of travelers and the quiet hum of the aircraft preparing for takeoff, the injustice of the situation became undeniable. In the face of humiliation, most people would have reacted with anger, frustration, or loud protest. The natural instinct when dignity is stripped away in public is to fight back immediately, to raise one's voice and make the injustice impossible to ignore. Yet the CEO chose a different path. His silence was not weakness but strength, a calculated restraint that spoke louder than any outburst could. He remained seated for a moment, his eyes calm but steady, his posture unwavering. The attendants expected him to argue, to create a scene that would allow them to portray him as disruptive or unreasonable. Instead, he gave them nothing of the sort. The measure of a person's character is not revealed when everything is going well but when they are forced into a corner where pride and dignity are on the line. For the CEO, this was such a moment. He could feel the weight of every eye on him, some sympathetic, others indifferent, and a few curious to see how he would react. He breathed deeply, allowing the emotions that threatened to surge through him to settle. His silence was not surrender but discipline. Years of experience in hostile boardrooms, years of proving himself in environments where people doubted his worth, had taught him that the loudest statement sometimes comes in the form of quiet restraint. The flight attendant's gaze lingered, as though waiting for him to raise his voice. She seemed prepared to summon security, already imagining the justification she would give, that he had been unruly, that he had refused to comply. But the CEO denied her that opportunity. His calmness unsettled her because it revealed that he was in control of himself, even if she believed she had control of the situation. Passengers nearby shifted in their seats, whispering about the obvious unfairness, but even they were struck by the way he carried himself, not broken, not diminished, but composed and dignified. There is a power in silence, one that unsettles those who thrive on confrontation. By refusing to meet hostility with hostility, the CEO shifted the balance. He had been humiliated publicly, yes, but he denied the attendants the satisfaction of seeing him unravel. His silence was a quiet protest, a refusal to let them define him by the seat they took away. It was as though he was saying without words, "You may strip me of this chair, but you will not strip me of my dignity." That quiet defiance was far more powerful than any angry outburst could have been. The man who had taken his seat leaned back comfortably, occasionally glancing at him with a smug satisfaction. The CEO caught his eye only once, offering not anger but a steady gaze that pierced through the arrogance. He did not lower himself to the level of confrontation, nor did he engage in a contest of words. Instead, his silence carried an air of confidence that unsettled the other passenger, as if reminding him that the power of a man is not in the seat he occupies but in the respect he commands without even speaking. Inside, of course, the CEO wrestled with emotions. He was human, after all. Anger stirred, humiliation weighed heavily, and the sting of injustice pressed against his calm exterior. Yet he chose to channel those feelings inward, not outward. He reminded himself that sometimes patience delivers a far greater blow than anger. He knew that the truth had a way of revealing itself, and those who humiliate others often expose their own character more than the person they try to demean. By remaining calm, he allowed their prejudice to stand naked before everyone watching. The passengers around him became silent witnesses to his strength. His restraint made the injustice even more glaring, because without a single word, it was clear who was in the wrong. His silence amplified the cruelty of the situation. Instead of distracting the moment with an argument, he forced everyone to sit with the discomfort of what they had just seen. They saw a man who had every right to demand justice, yet chose to hold his ground with quiet dignity, making the attendants' actions appear even more petty and unjust. In that cabin, filled with whispered conversations and the rustle of boarding preparations, his calm presence radiated an unspoken message: strength is not always in the raised voice, but in the disciplined heart that refuses to be broken. His silence was not just an act of personal control, it became a mirror reflecting the prejudice of the attendants and the entitlement of the man in his seat. The more he remained calm, the more their behavior stood out, stripped of excuses and exposed for what it truly was. The true measure of power often lies not in what a person owns or the titles they carry, but in the recognition of their identity when it is finally revealed. In that tense moment on the plane, when the CEO had been displaced and dismissed, few around him understood who he truly was. To the attendants, he was simply another passenger they could disregard, someone whose skin color and quiet demeanor made it easy for them to believe they could act without consequence. To the man who had taken his seat, he was a stranger of no importance, someone to be overlooked and brushed aside. But beneath the silence and the calm exterior was a man who carried influence, status, and respect that far exceeded the assumptions being cast upon him. Identity has a way of shattering illusions. While the attendants thought they were exerting authority, they had no idea that they were dealing with a leader who had earned global recognition. This was not just a businessman but a man who had overseen multinational projects, advised powerful boards, and stood in rooms where decisions affecting thousands of lives were made. His resume was filled with milestones that most could only dream of, yet here, at 30,000 feet, none of that shielded him from the sting of prejudice. Still, identity has a way of asserting itself, and eventually, it could not be hidden. As the flight settled, murmurs grew among the passengers. A few who recognized him whispered quietly, nudging one another, realizing with shock who was sitting silently in the wrong section of the plane. For those who knew, it was almost unthinkable. How could someone of his stature be treated with such disregard? How could an airline humiliate a man whose name commanded respect in boardrooms across the globe? The whispers carried, and soon, the attendants began to sense that something was not as simple as they had believed. The CEO did not need to raise his voice to declare who he was. His calm, composed manner already hinted at a depth that went beyond appearances. Identity, after all, does not always have to be announced, it carries itself with a presence that cannot be ignored. Yet when it became clear that the situation was not just a trivial inconvenience but a deliberate humiliation, the truth began to surface. Someone discreetly mentioned his name to a flight supervisor, and the reaction was instant. The calm confidence he had displayed all along suddenly had a context that others could not deny. For the attendants, the realization was staggering. In their attempt to reduce him to nothing more than a displaced passenger, they had underestimated the very man they were serving. His identity forced them to confront the reality of their actions. This was not simply about a mix-up or procedure, this was about a conscious choice to strip dignity from a man whose accomplishments far outweighed their assumptions. His identity became a mirror, reflecting back to them their prejudice and poor judgment. But more important than how the attendants reacted was how his identity changed the perspective of the other passengers. For them, the story transformed in real time. What had initially seemed like an uncomfortable moment of mistreatment now became a striking example of how society often fails to recognize greatness when it does not come packaged in the form they expect. They realized they had just witnessed a man of immense influence treated as though he were invisible, and the contrast was undeniable. The CEO himself remained steady, even as whispers spread and the atmosphere shifted. His power was never in announcing who he was, but in letting the weight of his identity reveal itself naturally. That is the mark of true leadership and strength, not needing to demand respect, because it eventually arrives on its own, drawn by the undeniable reality of who you are. For him, this was not just about his own vindication. It was a reminder that no matter how high one climbs, the shadow of prejudice can still try to pull you down. And yet, when your identity is rooted in real achievement and unshakable dignity, no amount of humiliation can erase it. The attendants who had once spoken down to him now shifted their tone, their words measured, their actions more careful. The man who had taken his seat grew visibly uncomfortable, realizing that the stranger he had dismissed so casually was far more than he appeared. Around them, the entire plane carried a new awareness. The CEO's identity had silently reshaped the entire situation, turning what was meant to be a moment of belittlement into one of undeniable recognition. His very presence reminded everyone watching that identity, once revealed, commands a respect that cannot be stolen by prejudice or arrogance. Prejudice is often most powerful when it hides behind procedure, when it disguises itself as professionalism or policy, making it harder to call out directly. On that flight, what unfolded was not just a mistake or a misunderstanding but a deliberate choice wrapped in the language of authority. The attendants used phrases like seating adjustments and company policy to cover their actions, but everyone watching could see the truth. It was not about logistics. It was about who they believed was deserving of that seat, and who was not. The moment revealed the quiet but sharp edges of discrimination, and it became impossible to ignore. The black CEO understood this reality deeply. He had faced it before in boardrooms, in negotiations, in countless professional settings where assumptions were made about his competence, his authority, or his right to be in the room. Yet, on that flight, the prejudice was stripped of subtlety. It came out in the condescending tone of the attendant, in the dismissive way his boarding pass was brushed aside, and in the speed with which another man, white, casually dressed, carrying none of the quiet dignity the CEO exuded, was ushered into his seat without question. The scene laid bare what so often remains hidden, that bias does not need to shout to wound, it only needs to whisper behind a smile. The hidden prejudice became clearer as the situation developed. Had this been a genuine error, it would have been handled with apologies and professionalism. The CEO would have been offered alternatives, spoken to with respect, and accommodated in a way that acknowledged the inconvenience. Instead, every word spoken to him was sharp, clipped, and meant to convey authority rather than service. It was not the handling of a problem but the execution of a judgment, that he did not belong in that seat. Passengers around them picked up on the unspoken layers. Some shifted uncomfortably, sensing that the explanations given did not add up. Others pretended not to notice, afraid to involve themselves in something that challenged the very system they trusted. But the quiet watchers knew. They recognized that what was happening was not about a mix-up, but about assumptions tied to the color of the CEO's skin. The contrast between the way he was treated and the way the other passenger was welcomed left little room for doubt. The cruel irony of prejudice is that it so often underestimates its target. The attendants did not know who the CEO was, nor did they care. They assumed he would simply comply, that he would swallow the injustice quietly and accept the diminished place they offered him. What they failed to see was that he had faced such underestimation his entire life and had risen above it every time. They could take the seat, but they could not strip away the resilience that came from years of triumph over obstacles others had never known. Prejudice thrives in silence, in the willingness of others to look away. In that cabin, the silence of many passengers seemed to strengthen the arrogance of those in control. Each moment of compliance from the crowd emboldened the attendants, as if their authority was validated by the lack of challenge. Yet silence has two sides. For the CEO, silence was not complicity but power. By holding his calm, he turned the spotlight back onto the attendants, forcing their prejudice to stand naked in front of everyone watching. Their actions could not be softened by excuses, because he gave them none to lean on. The hidden prejudice was also visible in the smirk of the man who took the seat. It was the look of someone who felt entitled, someone who believed without question that his comfort mattered more than another man's dignity. He did not pause to wonder why the seat was being reassigned, nor did he question whether it was fair. Instead, he slipped into privilege as easily as he slipped into the chair, embodying the silent complicity that allows prejudice to thrive. For the CEO, the sting of the moment was not just in the loss of a seat but in the familiar reminder that no amount of success could fully shield him from the judgment of others. He had worked tirelessly to build his reputation, to prove his worth again and again, yet here he was, reduced to nothing more than an assumption. Prejudice had followed him into the air, cloaked in procedure, and revealed itself in front of strangers. What the attendants and the passenger failed to grasp was that their actions were not isolated. They were part of a much larger story, one that countless people of color have experienced in different forms and in different places. It was the story of being overlooked, dismissed, and diminished not because of merit but because of perception. This moment on the flight became a living example of how prejudice hides, how it slips into everyday interactions, and how it quietly seeks to strip away dignity unless confronted. Dignity is not something that can be handed out by others, nor is it defined by the way someone is treated in a single moment. It is carried within, built from a lifetime of choices, struggles, and victories that shape a person's character. For the CEO, the lesson in dignity was not about teaching others with words but showing them through his response. Even in the face of humiliation, he refused to let his composure break. His posture remained straight, his expression calm, his silence deliberate. Every action he took communicated that his worth was not up for negotiation, and no one could diminish it, regardless of how they tried to treat him. As the aircraft settled into its flight, the injustice of the situation lingered in the air. Some passengers still whispered about what had happened, while others sat in quiet discomfort, unable to shake the unease of witnessing something so wrong. The CEO, however, did not fidget, did not sigh in frustration, and did not let his anger show. Instead, he sat with the quiet authority of someone who understood that dignity is not proven in comfort but in adversity. His every movement reflected the inner strength of a man who had endured prejudice before and chosen to rise above it. The attendants, though trying to mask their discomfort, began to realize that his silence carried more weight than any protest could have. By not engaging in arguments, he forced them to face their own actions without distraction. Their words sounded harsher against the backdrop of his calm, their prejudice more obvious in the contrast of his restraint. He was teaching them, without lecturing, what dignity looks like when tested. True dignity is also about refusing to mirror the ugliness that is directed at you. The CEO could have matched their dismissiveness with sharp words, could have met their arrogance with anger, but he chose instead to maintain his respect for himself. That choice was not about protecting the attendants from discomfort, it was about refusing to let them define his behavior. He would not let their prejudice dictate his identity or his actions. In that sense, he became the lesson itself. Everyone around him could see the contrast, those who tried to demean him revealed their smallness, while his composure revealed his greatness. Passengers continued to glance at him, some with sympathy, some with quiet admiration. To them, he was not just another traveler anymore. His calm in the face of humiliation became an unspoken lesson they carried with them. Dignity is not about demanding respect loudly, it is about embodying it so fully that others cannot help but notice. The CEO had turned the cabin into a stage where prejudice and dignity stood side by side, and his presence made it clear which one held true power. The man who had taken his seat grew increasingly uneasy. At first, he sat with a kind of smug entitlement, but as time passed and he saw the CEO's composure, the arrogance began to fade. There was something unsettling about sitting in a place that had been taken unfairly from someone who refused to bow his head. Without a word, the CEO had shifted the power dynamic. The entitled man, instead of feeling triumphant, began to feel the weight of guilt pressing against him. Dignity has that effect, it exposes the weakness in arrogance and makes injustice harder to ignore. Even the attendants, who had initiated the humiliation, found themselves glancing toward him with hesitation. His silence left them with no defense. They could not justify their actions by labeling him as aggressive or disruptive. They had nothing to point to except their own choices. And so, in the presence of his calm dignity, their authority seemed fragile, their excuses shallow. His restraint made their prejudice undeniable, and though they tried to carry on with their duties, they could not escape the lesson unfolding before them. The CEO understood something that many forget: dignity is not about the seat you hold, the title you carry, or the way others treat you. It is about refusing to let others dictate your worth. By holding on to his composure, he demonstrated a strength that no one could take away from him. He turned humiliation into a lesson, not just for the attendants who mistreated him, but for every passenger who watched the injustice unfold. His calmness became a mirror, showing people the difference between true strength and false authority. What those on the plane witnessed was not a man defeated but a man who understood that dignity cannot be taken, only surrendered. And surrender was something he would never allow. Respect is a fragile currency, one that can be stolen in an instant by prejudice but also restored through the strength of how one responds. On that flight, when the CEO was stripped of his rightful seat, he had every reason to lash out, to fight, or to demand immediate justice. Yet his decision to respond with composure transformed the entire situation. What began as an act of disrespect evolved into a powerful demonstration of how dignity and patience can reclaim honor in ways louder than confrontation ever could. The very people who had dismissed him were forced, over time, to see him in a new light. The cabin remained heavy with the memory of what had happened. Passengers who had witnessed the humiliation could not shake the image of the CEO being told to move, his rightful claim ignored in favor of another man. Yet as the minutes passed, their perception of him shifted. They saw how he carried himself, not bitter, not defeated, but steady and calm. It was in that silence that respect began to form, not only from those who already recognized his stature but also from those who realized they were watching a man who refused to be defined by the way others treated him. The attendants, who initially believed they had exercised control over the situation, began to feel the weight of their actions. At first, they justified it with their rehearsed explanations of policy and procedure, but the longer the CEO remained composed, the weaker those excuses sounded. They expected defiance or hostility, something they could point to as disruptive behavior. Instead, they were confronted with calmness that made their prejudice visible to everyone else. Slowly, their own respect began to surface, not out of kindness, but out of recognition. They could not ignore the quiet authority of a man who bore himself like a leader, even in the face of humiliation. For the other passenger who had taken the seat, the transformation was even more profound. He began the flight with entitlement, believing he had won something by occupying a place that was never his to claim. But as time went on, his sense of victory dissolved into discomfort. The CEO's restraint became a silent reminder that real strength is not in seizing what is not yours but in holding your dignity when it is unfairly taken. The man shifted in his seat, unable to shake the awareness that he was sitting in comfort while another bore the humiliation meant for him. Respect, in that moment, was no longer with the one sitting in luxury but with the one who sat quietly displaced, yet carried himself with unshakable composure. Among the passengers, whispers spread more deliberately now. Some recognized him as a leader they had seen in headlines or conferences, while others simply felt the weight of his presence. The story was no longer just about a man moved from a seat, it became about the undeniable strength of character that commanded admiration even from strangers. Respect grew in that cabin not because the attendants granted it, but because the CEO's response made it impossible to withhold. What made his response so powerful was its refusal to stoop to the level of those who had wronged him. Disrespect is often met with disrespect, escalating into a battle that leaves both sides diminished. But the CEO understood that real victory comes when you force others to confront their actions without giving them the excuse of your anger. His calm turned the spotlight fully onto them, leaving no doubt about where the failure lay. In doing so, he reclaimed the respect that had been denied to him, not by demanding it but by embodying it so completely that others had no choice but to acknowledge it. Over the course of the flight, the tone shifted. Attendants who had once spoken to him dismissively now measured their words carefully, their movements tinged with unease. The man who had taken his seat avoided his gaze, unable to meet the quiet strength that seemed to surround him. And the passengers, once silent, now looked at him with a recognition that grew deeper with every passing minute. Disrespect had started the story, but the ending belonged to respect, a respect that he created, not through anger, but through dignity. The CEO's response became an unspoken lesson for everyone present. It showed that respect cannot truly be taken away when a person carries themselves with discipline and grace. Even when stripped of his seat, he was never stripped of his authority, his presence, or his worth. By choosing patience over rage, calm over chaos, he forced the situation to transform. Disrespect may have opened the door, but respect filled the room as the reality of who he was became undeniable. In the end, the humiliation designed to belittle him became the very stage on which his strength turned the narrative around, leaving everyone to see that respect always finds its way back to those who refuse